your investors are going to bust your balls anyway. So you may as well ask for more and do a bigger project. And people are excited by bigger projects. I found it easier to raise money for a bigger project than for a smaller project. Even if someone was only going to put in $1 million, they sometimes would rather put in $1 million to a $300 million project than $1 million to a $15 million project. People just like being part of something that's big and glamorous.
You are listening to the Property Developer Podcast, your home for tips, ideas, and inspiration to help take your developing to the next level. Now here's your host, Justin Getty.
Hello and welcome to episode 111 of the show. How are you doing? I'm doing well and have an amazing guest coming up. An Aussie developer in New York City who is involved with building an amazing slimline residential tower overlooking Central Park along what has become known as Billionaire's Row. Really great conversation about that project and many more that he's done. So you might have noticed it's been a few months since the last podcast, and that's because I had to take an active role in getting my townhouse project finally finished. As you know from my updates, the project was running very late and suffering from frustrating delays. So I had to be very proactive and direct with the builder to get it done. I was attending site every day and doing whatever I could to keep things moving along and ultimately get things wrapped up, which I'm glad to say it is now finally completed. It was just over 500 days late, about double the amount of time it should have taken to build. But it's done and has been handed over to me with a number of settlements already taking place. As you can imagine, some of the buyers who purchased off the plan, like up to 4 years ago, were getting very, very frustrated with the delays and excuses. Sales of the remaining units has been slower than I hoped, and we've sold 9 out of 14, with prices being good but not great. So you might be wondering what some of the key lessons are that I've learnt so far during this period. And here's a couple that I thought I would share with you. The first one is that a good construction contract provides clarity and a strong foundation for starting the build. A balanced contract that provides protection for both sides is what you want, not something drafted by a building association that favours the builder. Most of the common construction contracts used by residential builders give them so much flexibility and control that it's difficult for owners to step in if things are going badly. Fortunately, we had a really good contract and that helped a lot. Another thing to remember is that you learn the most through challenging events. It might not be fun going through them, but when you get to the other side, you have so much more experience and confidence in yourself. I've learned so much about construction contracts, building techniques, and defects that I will always have knowledge about. So the hardest metals are forged in the hottest fires. Next is the importance of the team of people around you really becomes apparent during challenging circumstances. I had incredible support from our architecture firm, Sarah Stribley Architects, and our quantity surveyor, Brendan from Napier and Blakely. Their advice, support, and insight was invaluable to me during some pretty challenging periods. So be sure to work with the best people you can afford. Next, with my mentoring clients, we work on understanding their standards and expectations, and this is because it's important to know what you will allow to happen during your life and your projects. What are you going to be prepared to accept through your project and during the build? Yes, there will be compromises made throughout the project, but what are the things you won't compromise on? It's important that you maintain your standards so you deliver a product you can be proud of and also know that it meets your expectations. You will develop a good reputation if you stick to your standards, and you will be happy with yourself along the way. Finally, the biggest lesson is to never give up on your mission. Even at the most challenging times, when building work had stopped, when the bank had suspended payments, when work was below standards, I never ever doubted I would get the project finished. And I did it. So it's been a pretty crazy couple of years. This project has dragged on far beyond what I ever anticipated due to the pandemic arriving right in the middle of it. But I've survived it and taken a lot of strength from it. I think I could easily write another book about what happened. I know there are lots of people out there struggling with similar issues getting their houses and projects built. So just know you are not alone, and I wish you the best in getting things finished. Anyway, our project is built, it looks good, the new residents are happy, we are selling down the remaining stock, and we live to fight another day. Just before we get to our guest, don't forget that if you want to become a property developer, I've put together the perfect course to get your first small-scale residential property development project started and finished. There is a lot happening across the country right now to help facilitate more homes getting built for our growing population. So if you want to be in a position to cash in on the wave of growth that is coming, then be sure to check out www.propertydevelopertraining.com for everything you get. Now is the time to get ready to take advantage of the opportunities that are coming. All right, let's get to our guest and his amazing story. I thought my first project being 20 townhouses was a great start, but this guy did a huge apartment project in New York City for his first development project. David Juracich is originally from Australia before moving overseas to work in banking and finance. His story of how he got involved with property development in New York City is quite amazing and includes his involvement in an 84-level slimline skyscraper called Steinway Tower, overlooking Central Park, which apparently cost $2 billion to build. Yes, that's $2 billion. Can you imagine the capital stack on that project? Well, we talk about that and much, much more. This is quite an incredible story of a guy stumbling into large-scale property developing in one of the world's most expensive real estate markets. Let's get right into it by finding out what food David would eat until he was sick.
Steak, 3-inch thick New York strip. I could eat that all day.
For listeners not from New York, give us a bit of a description about the famous New York
Well,
strip.
there's the steak. Look, the steak is very different here because it's grain fed. I know we have grain finished beef in Australia, but here it's not necessarily better for your health, but it's because it's got much more fat through the meat. I think it's extremely very tasty. And one thing the Americans do is they will have they make their steaks much thicker than we do back home. So 2 to 3 inches is the norm, and then you'd slice that steak up. And the steakhouses here are unique in that they cook at an extremely high temperature. So it's often called black and blue, or and it's because it's literally burnt on the outside, but blue and rare in the middle and virtually cold. But they just do incredible creamed corn and creamed spinach and mashed potatoes with these thick steaks. And Luger's in Brooklyn sort of developed it, and they've been around 150 years. And there's been 50 or 60 chefs over the last 50 or 60 years that have left Luger's, spent 20, 30, 40 years there and opened up their own outposts. So nearly every famous steakhouse, one of their little mantras is, "Oh, our chef's ex-Luger's." But regardless of that, they're all very good, and it's the difference is the beef is a little different, and they make it very, very thick here, and they cook it. Like I said, we don't. They cook it at incredibly high temperatures. I was going to say Fahrenheit temperatures, but I can't. I don't know how to convert it back into Celsius because I've been away for too long. But anyway, yes, steak is my food of choice.
Well, you're making me hungry now. Anyway, now we're here today to talk about property development. You're an expat Aussie living in New York, and I came across your name when I was reading through a book called Billionaire's Row, which is a great story about a number of high-rise developments in New York City, slender skyscrapers, so built quite narrow. And your name popped up in the book as one of the people involved in one of those projects, which we'll get to shortly.
It was quite a readable book, wasn't it? It flowed much more than I thought it would when I first picked it up.
Yeah, no, well, generally when you have journalists writing these kind of books, they tend to be quite engaging. So, and I've told lots
Yeah.
of people that they should read it. So, if you haven't read it, it's definitely worth a read. Billionaire's Row. Reading through it was quite enlightening in terms of how different developing in New York City is to, say, residential development that most of the listeners are probably familiar with. But there were still some lessons there. Certainly some familiarity as well in terms of how deals get structured. It's just on a much bigger, complicated scale. But we'll get into all that soon. Before we do, give us a bit of a quick run through about how David went from living in Melbourne to living in New York and a few other cities along the way. And you didn't start out in property, but that's where you've ended up.
Correct. Grew up in Kew and studied at Monash, banking and finance. I wanted to get into the finance industry, and subsequently went to Japan to be what's called a money broker in the interest rate swaps, when at the time I didn't realize that it was in the heyday of the expansion of what's called the derivatives markets and the fixed income markets within banking. I wanted to be in trading. So I ended up spending 9 years with a company called Tokyo Forex in Japan, and then went to Hong Kong with a British company called Intercapital, and then came to the New York doing the same thing, just changing from yen derivatives. It's a derivative of the bond market into US dollar denominated interest rate swaps for a Swiss firm called Tradition. And that was in 2003. So I left Australia in 1993 and got here in 2003, worked through some boom times. And but during the crash, so when I left Japan, the heydays were the 90s, and people would always, a lot of my friends when I left were saying, "You'll never have this again. This will never happen again." And I got to America and it was happening all over again. The everything was on steroids. It was fascinating how much money there was in everything you did and everywhere you went, and every event was unbelievable. And the whole time was every day seemed like a boom time. And they were certainly very good times for me working, but I was starting to get over my job. Like a lot of people, you feel like you've hit a ceiling and you're not learning anymore. And I lived in a place called Nolita, next to Soho, north of Little Italy, and I used to walk into work. Now I get to work at 5:36 every morning, but and then I'd walk home, which was down in Wall Street area. And I kept seeing in those early O's people putting in $1.5 million into an old loft, buying an old loft and putting 500,000 into the loft, and then selling it so they're 2.2 million into something and selling it for 4 million. And I kept hearing this over and over again, and I kept seeing examples of it. And I'm like, what is going on? And Tribeca and the whole southern Manhattan was rebuilding after prices were a little bit depressed because of September 11. People had left, and then it just came back with a boom. And this, I guess, is something a little bit different about America than Australia, and is when they have booms, they're real booms. And when they have bust, it's a real bust. Things can go up 60 or 70% overpriced where it should be, but they can also fall 60 or 70%, whereas we're much more controlled. We'll say it's a boom if it's 10% over, and a real bust 10% under. It's a much finer line. But Americans get hyped up and things go well over where they should be. And at the same time, when they have a bust, they have a proper bust. Like I always tell my friends when they talk about a sale, or when I go back to Australia and you see these huge signs, liquidation sale, 40% off, or end of year sale, 30 and 40% off, or 50% off. I'm like, no, in America, you have 90 off, 90 and 95 off. when you do a deal, when they do a deal, they just do a deal. But anyway, they things were going crazy, and I was starting to lose interest in my job. But the whole process of changing took more than a few years. But I started getting very interested in it, and I wanted to get in touch with brokers. I wanted to do what I'd heard other people do. Like I said, buy something cheap or an estate sale or something, and then fix it up. But the more I spoke, if I said I had 2 million, Americans only really care about big numbers. And when you're looking at something for 2 or 2.5 million, they don't really care. You have to tell them you've got 20 or 30 million. And it didn't take me long to catch on to, and I'd been working with Americans my whole time in Japan as well. And it's just a very different culture than Australians. And there was a lot of Brits in trading as well. And so I just started talking bigger. And then they really, not only do they pay you more attention, but they want to bring you into their whole circle. So I didn't know anything about real estate, apart from the fact, hey, some people are buying things and then flipping them. But it went from me wanting to flip an apartment or a loft here or there to then me meeting their architects and the brokers' contacts in the architectural industry and the construction industry and other bankers and things like that. And then I really did think, wow, I can probably borrow a lot more than I thought. And I could really buy a building if it came up, or like, of course, I knew I had to be careful and I couldn't just go and do anything. But I was starting to learn more and more just by talking bigger numbers and being in this field that everyone wants you. When you're talking big numbers, they think you're a success and that everyone wants to be part of it, which is, again, very different sometimes in Australia, where you feel like people think that you're boasting or something. But they want to be part of it. They want to bring you into their groups. And I just, through a process of, like I said, I would start work very early. I'd be up at 4:30 most days and at work sometime between 5:30 and 6:30, depending on the day. But I'd be leaving at 5:30 every night, and I would straight away go out and go and look at properties with brokers. And I started, instead of looking at apartments, I would be looking at entire buildings, and some to just buy and redo maybe and rent out for a certain return, and some to actually pull down and renovate. Anyway, through that, I met a young guy American, so I thought he knew a lot about construction and development, but he knew about as much as me. But because he's American, he just talked a really big game. Anyway, we ended up joining together, and we ended up buying some land in 2008, right at the wrong time in Brooklyn, in a place called Gowanus, Brooklyn. And we put, so it was early 2008, we probably put $2 million into this piece of land that we were going to. So we put a whole, there's avenues, as people have heard in America, there's avenues and streets. The avenues are the huge thoroughfares, and the streets are what people would live on. So the avenues will be much more commercial domains, and that's where you would walk to get to the subways, and the shops will be there. And the streets, when you talk about 37, 38, 39, all those streets are where you live on. And so in Brooklyn, the avenue, and I sort of learned too that governments really can, with proper planning, just completely change areas by changing the permitting, etc. And there was one avenue in Brooklyn near the Barclays Center where the Brooklyn Nets play, called 4th Avenue, and it had a whole lot of huge taxi car park lots on it. Brooklyn was only starting to gentrify, and it had U-Haul lots, and what I mean is, so these huge lots where there would be dark spaces in between them, and there's a subway like 1 kilometer apart from each other on these two avenues, and too many people were being scared or beat up on this avenue going to and from these two subways. And the city wanted to do something about it, even though in a lot of New York, they have very strict rules on height. Even though we think it's the city of really tall buildings, they're very historic. They're very conscious of their history, and they don't let things go too high in historic areas, and lots of Brooklyn is historic areas. However, this one avenue is a key avenue, and they wanted it to be safer for women and kids and everyone. And the way you make things safer is by having more people around and more lights and more action. So they changed the whole zoning requirements of this avenue to, instead of it being a 4-story height, you could build to 15 stories, and you could get a lot higher FAR and with any one particular project. And what that was going to do is bring thousands of new apartments to the avenues and the corresponding businesses that would come along it, and hence there would be people and traffic 24 hours, which would make the whole thing safer. Anyway, what happens is, if you buy some land and you put 3 or 4 parcels of land together, the zoning requirements or the advantages you can get from one piece, if you put them together into one tax lot that flows to the whole lot. And this kid, I was 38 at the time, he was 28, came to me with this proposal. Why don't we buy this tiny, really long, tiny, thin strip on 4th Avenue where we can get to 15 stories and we can build a boatload of apartments. But it's a very long, thin strip that's so long and thin, no one's ever known what to do with it. But he had this plan to buy these 2 other large blocks behind it on the streets, the actual streets, not the avenue. And we would build our really tall building on the street. Now, the reason why you'd want to do that is because the streets are a lot more prestigious, being this is 8th Street in Brooklyn, 4th Avenue and 8th Street. So it's a lot more prestigious address to say you're on 8th Street than it is to say you're on 4th Avenue. And we were right by a subway, the 9th Street subway. And he had this idea, and I hummed and hawed with him for probably a year. He had no other options. And I helped him put together some proposals where we made sure we were legally sound, etc. Anyway, we ended up buying this land. And then we had to go out and get some loans, but we pumped probably $2 or $3 million into this. We knocked everything down, and we put $1.6 million worth of concrete into the ground, built our whole substructure. And then the global financial crisis came. And I was in it, living and breathing it 16, 18 hours a day. And I was convinced the world was coming to an end. And I remember coming home to Australia, I think that Christmas of 2008, saying to people, batten down the hatches. Like, Australia didn't really get hit compared to in America. Every single day, just going this 2.5 kilometer walk to and from work, I'd see another business gone out of business every single day. Everyone you knew was losing their jobs. Everything was going bankrupt. And so I was sure no one in Brooklyn was ever going to be able to afford our apartments ever again. Well, not for a long time, but we didn't have any debt on it. And I fortunately had a little bit of money, and I just said to my partner, look, I'm just considering this as a land bank. We got to lock it all up. We got to come back in 5 years' time. We literally did that. We couldn't get, the banks just stopped lending, full stop. And so there was no way of us getting any construction loan. And so we locked it all up. The city, there's a law that you're not allowed to keep an open hole for longer than 60 days. And so, of course, we had this huge hole with all of our groundwork in and loads of the topsoil, and the city comes and fills it in for you. So we had our entire structure filled in, substructure filled in, and then they charge you $60,000 for it. But I was like, it doesn't matter. We're going to come back in 10 years and we'll fix it. We can't do it now. So I was shell-shocked. But because the problem with development that most of your people will know is the danger is if something like that happens and you're leveraged, then you're screwed. But I knew, look, yes, I can afford this land. We had no debt on it. I was just going to have the money in the bank anyway. I'm just going to hold this land for the next 5 or 10 years. So I wasn't really panicked because it wasn't. I was actually having making more money than I ever made in my life during the crisis and the whole trading and everything. And so I'm like, fine. And then, but buildings really did, and property really does crash in America when it crashes. And this other chap who I was working with, Michael, he then kept looking for things in Manhattan, and he calls me 3 or 4 weeks later and says, I've got something that I really think you should look at. And I went and looked at it with him, and it ended up being that Verizon, which is one of that the Bell Corporation had built a building in 1929, and it was now Verizon, and they were trying to, the telephone companies own a fantastic amount of properties. They own tens of thousands of property across the country. And they'd been told that they had to start selling some of their properties. And this building that they've had since 1929 used to have, to this day, it still has all of the Bloomberg terminals go through it, and all of the landline telephone calls from Manhattan go through this one building. But whereas that used to take 19 floors of equipment, it now takes a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot box on one of the floors, and they had call centers there, etc. And anyway, they didn't need the call centers there. They could be down in far west Jersey, etc., where it's a lot cheaper. So they were trying to sell things, and so they wanted to sell the top half of the building. And a lot of people were thinking at the time, this is weird, and why would you buy only half a building? But as a complete newcomer to it, I was thinking, and of course my partner agreed, you never want to buy the stuff on the ground floor. That's the stuff that you just get rid of at cost value anyway. You make all your money on the top apartments. So why wouldn't we just be elevated above the street? And so anyway, long story short, through basically sheer stupidity and ignorance, we put a bid in for this building, and it was for floors 8 through to 19, the top floor. And it's an old historic building. It's Art Deco. The walls are 2 foot thick, 20 inches of concrete in between all the floors, beautifully built, but people really didn't get it. And it had small windows. It was a telephone building made for telephone equipment. And so the only people thinking of doing anything with it were people who were considering turning this into commercial office space. Now, vacancy rates in Manhattan in the space of months went from commercial office space went from a 97, 98% occupancy rate to a 65% occupancy rate. So we put a bid in for this building of 25 million. And even then thinking, what are we doing? We don't really know what we're doing. And we're going to have to obviously borrow most of it. And we didn't have all the money. And there was 2 bids above us, 33 million and 35 million, but they were planning on turning this into commercial office space. Now they had, because they were experienced and knew what they were doing, they had a whole lot of contingencies in with their bids, and we didn't. And the Verizon people, so I find all this out subsequently. My partner and I, we spent $350,000 on legal to close the deal when the deal was about to happen. And we used these Hasidic Jews who were in the back of Brooklyn, who charged us way less than anyone else. And Verizon has to use its, not that being a Hasidic or Jewish has anything really to do with it, but lots of them have own accounting or legal firms, and they're very good at what they do. They just aren't in the glamorous, charge you $1,500 an hour Manhattan one. So my other partner's Jewish, and so he put me onto this. He's like, no, there's better lawyers out there that'll charge us half or a quarter as much. And so we met these guys, and so that was the point of that, because he pushed me that way, and I'm like, this is amazing. But we spent $350,000, which I thought was a lot. Whereas Verizon had to use their own legal department, a corporation of hundreds of thousands of people. It's an entity in a country unto itself. And they're told, no, you can only use the Verizon legal department in Texas. And that every department within Verizon, like many companies, has to be its own profit center unto itself. So it's charging the rest of its company out at commercial rates and trying to make a profit. So our 350 grand was, and they spent 1.2 million on their legal. Now, I found all this out later, but they came to us because they didn't want to go down. They'd been down the road too many times with a developer. They'd spent 7 or 8 or 900,000 already on legal with their own company being billed for it. Verizon Real Estate gets billed, and then the developer pulls out because of some of these contingencies. But like I said, the reason why they have contingencies is because they're experienced and they've been through there before, and you need to have contingencies. But anyway, they came to us and said, listen, would you pay 25 million with no contingencies? And through sheer stupidity, we said yes. And it was suddenly ours. And I thought it was amazing. And I thought we got it for a good price. But what do I know? I'm dealing interest rate swaps all day, every day. And like what happens to most people, and definitely happened to me, had buyer's remorse and suddenly realized, what if I spent 20 million overpriced for this? And so I felt smart the day before when we were about to close it, thinking, yeah, we're getting this for a steal. And the day after, I thought, I've been done over. But anyway, I subsequently...
Sorry to interrupt. Just before you move on, can you just give us a sense of how big we're talking here? How much space you actually bought?
Yeah, so
in square meters. I know you're probably still in feet.
Yeah, so it was 140,000 square feet, which it roughly at 10 is, and like I said, when we went and we're taking people through this. For a start, many of the floors were office centers and call centers, and this is the O's where computer screens were still huge, big boxes. And I'd taken potential investors and bankers through there, and the ceiling heights are 14 and 16 feet ceiling heights. It's an old school Art Deco, beautifully built building. But because it had been a call center, they had lifted the floors 3 floors, and there was literally millions and millions of feet of cables on every single, that had built up over 100 years on every single floor. And the ductwork of everything of the ductwork had pulled another 3 or 4 feet down and the ductwork was like 1950s ductwork to air condition it, pulled it down 4 or 5 feet. So you literally went in there thinking it's only like a 9.5 foot floor to ceiling height. So it felt claustrophobic. The windows were already very small because it was designed as a telephone building. But if there was any window space, because the call center people had these huge computer screens that we used to none of us could have the sun on it or you couldn't see it, everything was closed up. And so it was a very claustrophobic feeling and not appealing. And we had to rip away we had to get permission on one of the floors to rip away part of the roof and the floor to give people a real sense of the height. And this is a long-winded way of getting around to the square foot. We had to somehow invent more square footage to make it seem, to make it become logical. And there was a few ways we could do that. We had to get really creative and work out a way to get more height on the building and to build more floors. Because this is a historic district, the Chelsea Historic District, and it's an historic building, and you can't just, it was grandfathered, it's a low level area, and you can't, but the height was grandfathered in, but we certainly couldn't build any more. We found a loophole because the elevator shaft was from 1929, the elevator shafts actually, in those days, would go up another 120 feet to hold all of the stabilizing equipment and motor equipment, and very high, like 7 or 8 floors. We found some some nuances to the law that we argued for about a year in different sort of Department of Building courts, that we should actually be able to build to the height. The grandfathering was the height of the original building, and all parts of the building matter for that. So we were actually allowed to build up to the height of the actual elevator shafts, and so we put on another 4 floors. But in those days, the emergency, so of course everyone needs emergency stairs. In those days, this building had 3 of them, 2 on the north and the south side of the east side of the building, and 1 on the west side of the building. And stairs built in 1929 aren't the same as they're built right now when you go to your emergency exit in whatever building you're going to go down, where they're very efficient, very small, and etc. It was the long, big, winding stairs with a huge donut hole in the middle where you could look down, and that went for 20 floors. Anyway, just the point was that, and they were all in magnificent real estate. These are the 3 corners of the building that you'd want to be at. We actually ended up cutting out all of those stairs and filling them in and turning everywhere where there was a staircase, turning them into the master bedroom of that apartment, and then putting the emergency stairs, drilling, sawing into the concrete in the middle of the building and putting the emergency stairs. So we gained about another 45,000 square feet by jiggling around, getting a little bit extra height and finding that space. So it ended up being about 185,000 square feet, and which enabled us to build 47 or 48 apartments that were on the larger side. So 200 to 450 square meter apartments.
That's good size.
Yeah, and so we ended up, we were told, we ended up buying the building. And when we finished, so fortunately, so this is another thing, how just large corporations just make you shake your head. So Verizon didn't want to waste money on legal, and so they gave it to us cheaper than the 2 other bids. But second, we needed an extension. There's what's called an exclusive right to negotiate. So and that means you put down 1% as the exclusive right to negotiate, and we did that. We saw it a couple of days after Lehman collapsed in late 2008, so September 2008, and they gave us the building that told us we'd won the bid probably January 2009, and by February we put it at 1% down as exclusive right to negotiate. By March or April we put another 9% down, and we went hard, and we literally had to close in 90 days then. Now fortunately they weren't ready, and they wanted to sell the building. They were pushing us so much to be in a position to buy. They badly wanted to sell it, and yet they wanted to lease it back to us, triple net lease for minimum of 2 years. And they were putting all this pressure on them. They're like, what is going on? To the point where right up until the day we closed, of course, you just couldn't get financing. And so we got what's called a hard money loan, and which was half of the money. So there was $3 million of expenses, legal and a bunch of other things. So we needed $28 million. We got $14 million in a hard money loan, and then we literally had to put money in ourselves, and I begged, borrowed, and stole from friends, $14 million. And we brought in another partner. We actually didn't know what we were doing, and we brought in a partner that had done 30 years of experience in Manhattan real estate. Like, why was I dictating all of this from a trading room floor, getting involved in something that I had no justification to get involved in? But we ended up bringing in another partner, and they brought it called Property Markets Group. And we literally, I begged $8 million from a bunch of different people. And but even on the last day, some of the wires weren't coming in, and we asked them for 2 more months extension and we'd pay them $1 million more for 2 months. $1 million more for 2 months. And they said no. And they were adamant they were going to, they had their lawyers go crazy at us and tell us that they were going to, take our 10% deposit and they were going to sue us and etc. And when we were willing to pay them $1 million for two extra months. Now, the reason ends up being that not only did they not want to get a legal bill, but they had been given targets to sell. And I don't know if it was a dollar target or a square footage target, but that part of the real estate, Verizon's huge, America's huge. There's real estate department's huge, but there's a real estate department for each part of the country. That department had got a target to close XYZ number of square foot or dollars in 2009. And if they didn't do that, their bonus that normally comes in March or April wasn't going to come. So they didn't care that the company was going to make $1 million more. They cared about their bonus, even though they were renting the building office for another 2.5 years. So they could have saved themselves a minimum of 2 months' rent, if not more. If they had given us more notice, we would have more time. We would have taken more, and they could have made more money. But they didn't care because, like I found out later on, it was due to the Verizon's real estate department wanting to hit their certain goal, and that would trigger all their bonuses. So we ended up closing. There was a panic, like I said, even up until the date. We actually got a 1-day extension. December 30th, some of the money hadn't come in, and it came in by December 31, and we did the proper close then. And the fortunate thing is, so I have many friends who are into property in Australia or Melbourne. They've come and that building was called Walker Tower, and it ended up being a huge success, and people have come and seen it. And they always say, and rightfully so, how did you do it? And we could never do this in Australia. And I don't know anything about real estate. I hadn't built anything. And a couple of things happened in my favor that didn't really happen in Australia, because I said it really is boom and bust here. People that were building the Freedom Tower or Hudson Yards, $20 billion developments, suddenly had no work. There was no work anywhere. So not only could we not afford those people anyway, the Tish Constructions, etc. Not only could we not afford them normally, and they wouldn't look at our smaller, there was 176 million cap stack. They wouldn't look at our project, and we wouldn't be able to afford them. But that none of them had any work, and they were doing anything to keep their people employed. So they'd now look at a smaller project and they'd charge out rates that were that we could afford. So we ended up having architects that would never have work with us, construction people that we had so many different experts, engineering firms that would never have looked sideways. So I got this lesson, this university degree in construction and building management from true experts in their field who were just teaching me, a guy who knew how to look at Excel and trade interest rate swaps. And it was fascinating because I was the positive recipient of so much talent that their firms literally didn't have work. And so that, between that and bringing on this other firm, Property Markets Group, it was like doing an RMIT engineering degree or construction management degree, and I learned very, very quickly. And so that was a positive, that was the thing that actually helped us. We were the only man standing, and to the point where so when I thought I'd paid over for the project for this building, of course I thought it was cheap. And then, like I said, as soon as you buy it, you're like, why am I the sucker? The guy that doesn't know anything about real estate, I'm the one buying it. Of course, I've been sucker punched. I've paid 20 million too much. What the hell is going on? But it just so happens that because we could hold on within 2 weeks of closing, so it took up until we started talking to them, obviously, in September 2008, and then negotiating all of 2009. But by 2010, within the first 2 weeks of 2010, Tommy Hilfiger's family office offered us nearly 100 million for the building because they wanted to turn it into a luxury building. That was the first. So it was that and the fact that Starwood came in. Like, Starwood is the gorilla in every room to do with real estate in America and most of the the northern hemisphere. They are 1 or 2 degrees of separation involved in everything. They're so big. They wouldn't normally look at us, but they actually have these funds like, I mean, I know that a lot of your listeners will already know this, but some don't. Like, we hear about these different funds have funds within funds, and they're normally with real estate and private equity funds, they're all the same. They're normally about 10-year funds. So you can legally open them and close them, but for the first 2 or 3 years, you can get the fund going without the full, say it's you've said to investors, we're going to set $100 million aside for XYZ. The first 2 or 3 years, you can raise the money, and it has to be deployed over the next 5, 6, 7 years. And in the years 8, 9, and 10, you have to start selling it and getting rid of things so you can close that fund down. Now, there's a few reasons why it's allowed to go longer, but generally you're supposed to buy and sell something within 10 years. And if you don't get that money deployed in that first 2 or 3 years, that, depending on the fund and the type of everything, there's a whole lot of ifs and buts. But generally, you have to go and give the money back. And all of these firms like Starwood make money from having the money. They'll make their 1 or 2% carry fee. So they never want to give it back because they want to keep all this money. And they didn't have anything to, it was called the SoFi 7 Fund at Starwood. They didn't have anything to invest in. And so they were literally willing to put $42.5 million. They bought 50% of the project. That we had bought the whole thing for 28 million, 25 plus 28 million. They bought 50% for 42.5. So it was then worth 90 million. And that was the first time I thought, okay, so we didn't do too badly. And then a couple of days later, the Tommy Hilfiger offered us just over 100. But we already had committed partners then, and it wasn't up to me because we all had partners. And I was excited by where this would go. And so having those guys teach me a lot about the financing, it ended up becoming the highest IRR project they've ever done in the history. And some of the young guys there who were put onto this little project were saying they've become mini famous within the company for doing this thing that gave them the highest IRR that they've ever had for a real estate project. So, but it ended up being we were at the right time, right place as the economy. By the time we finished in 2012, 2013, everything was booming, and we ended up selling our apartments. We sold below Central Park, below 57th Street. A few years earlier, a building called 157 West 57th Street had set the new record for the highest price of apartment. Bill Ackman bought it for $90 million, and that's one of those super talls you were talking about. But if that building hadn't come along, it would have been the highest price per square foot. We had the record for the highest price per square foot ever for downtown. Once that building came along, it was ever for below 57th Street, and the highest outright price of any apartment below 57th Street. And it was because of, look, we literally had these amazing people working for us and teaching us as a result of that global financial crisis. And then we ended up taking all of that team that we had. Suddenly I realized, Brooklyn's not dead, and Brooklyn started taking off. And we took that whole team and all of that knowledge we'd gained, and we took it back to the Brooklyn project. And that ended up becoming Starwood financed that with us, and we used the same architect, a company called Setra Ruddy. And we'd, by this stage, taken a whole lot of the guys. We had a huge team that we self-developed, but we'd taken them all from Tisch Construction. And we had our own team, and we went and rebuilt that place in Brooklyn, and it ended up being a huge, and it just so happened that within the 3-year period that we'd closed it down, Whole Foods had announced 400 yards away that they were going to be putting in a Whole Foods in Brooklyn, and this area Gowanus was about to take off. And so that ended up being very, very, very successful for us as well. But that Walker Tower project was the one that sort of really, because people always ask me, especially like, I know ordinarily you're supposed to go from flipping a few houses to maybe building a house or two, to maybe building a small apartment block somewhere, to building a bigger apartment block, and then you build Juracich Tower in downtown Melbourne or something. And I just went straight to building, an apartment that was our penthouse sold for 50.1 million to. There's a story in that as well, but that was in a very funny book here, and it got repossessed by the Department of Justice because it was all the people who bought it were. So there was. Have you ever heard of a guy called Jolo from
yes,
the Malaysian Jolo? Yes,
another
from
great
the one
billion-dollar whale.
Yes, billion-dollar whale. So the one in the development fund that he stole from, his partner was a guy called Al Kabasi, who now is in jail. Al Kabasi came with me and he didn't. His broker came with me and someone else, and we walked them the penthouse of the building, and there was he was FaceTiming him and speaking Arabic to him, and they bought it. Within no negotiating or anything like that, and they just bought it 2 hours later. They said they'd buy it. When they came to buy it, actually pay for it, about a year later, when we were closing on most of the apartments, 2 Cadillac Escalades. They're SUVs, large trucks, SUVs, extra long SUVs in the States, Cadillac Escalades. These guys, there were 7 or 8 of them that came in 2 SUVs and parked outside our partner PMG Property Market Group's office on 5th Avenue. We were on 18th Street and they're on 26th, and we were up there on 26th Street doing the closings that day. And they came and they parked in front with brand new black Cadillacs, brand new, because you could see how they don't even have a license plate on them. They just have a piece of paper. I don't know whether they bought them that day or 3 days earlier. And they came into our office, or my partner's office, Elliot Joseph's office, and they came with duffel bags of money and lots and lots of checks from the Coconut Planters Bank of the Philippines and XYZ Bank of the Virgin Islands, and $800,000 checks, $1.2 million checks, 1.8 to make up $50.1 million. And they came with $3.5 million of cash. So we had all of the people in the office counting over and over again so that we didn't make mistakes, counting $3.5 million. And of course, because we had checks from Cayman Island banks and Bahamian banks and Virgin Island banks, and remember, it's stuck in my mind, the Coconut Planters Bank of the Philippines. Of course, we couldn't give them title that day or any time. Those checks take 8 to 10 weeks to clear. And there was a few money laundering questions that the banks answer, and they get all that information. We don't really have to do it. We just have to report, hey, this might be a little suspicious. But it all got cleared. But they ended up leaving that day in one of the SUVs, and they left the other one there, and they never came back. It got 2 tickets a day for the next 2 weeks. And then the cops just came and took it away. And they've never seen the apartment since. They never even went to the apartment. Anyway, so he was part of the billion-dollar whale scheme. He was Joe Lowe's partner. Yeah. And so
another great
that was just a funny side story. Yes, exactly. But because of Walker Tower, then Verizon wanted to sell us more buildings, and they sold us another building that was by the same architect, and it was on 50th Street in Hell's Kitchen, and Starwood wanted to be part of that, and so they financed it, and we all did it again as a rinse and repeat. And then Starwood came to us and said, hey, we've got this block of land on 57th Street, and we want to build a tall building, but you've been building these last 2 things with no union labor, and we will not be able to do that. We'll have all of our hotels picketed all throughout the country if we go non-union. So what if we sell you 30% of this, and we'll say it's your project, and you guys develop it? And it went from there. So it was because of that one positive development that happened with Walker Tower because of the crash that Stellar Tower ended up happening 57th Street, Steinway Tower and 57th Street happened that week. We were able to close and get our success rate up. With Brooklyn ended up doing 3 or 4 projects there. But we had some sort of real sort of beginner's luck due to a bunch of things outside of our control. Manhattan real estate just went crazy for 3 or 4 or 5 years with astronomical prices. We were selling, we were thinking if we could just sell for 2,000 a square foot, we'll all be rich. This will be amazing. This will be incredible. Like 2,000 a square foot. That was our aspirational price. We ended up selling it for 4,500 a square foot, which is, what's that? 45,000 a square meter, and US dollars. And that was about a confluence of not only us being one of the few men standing. It was the first time anyone, look, we were introduced to concepts that other developers, because we were new, we were more open to the ideas than other developers. So that's sort of the benefit of being new too. So for instance, our architect, Setra Ruddy, who was very established and very old, had always been pushing to build more higher end features in the apartments, beautiful kitchens, beautiful bathrooms. Now, the thinking was, even if you go to somewhere like 15 Central Park West, which is known as one of the most premier buildings in the country, if not the world, with every billionaire in the world that had lived there when it was finished in late O's, one of the most prestigious buildings in America. The concept was that if any rich person is not going to like what you do, and they're just going to rip it out. So, no, don't put in high-end anything because they're just going to rip it out and it's a waste of money. And B, go lower end because it will open up the field. You can sell it for a little cheaper and more people will be able to afford it. And that was very rigid thinking by all developers. You could not go anywhere and think that there was lots of places that, yeah, you go nice, but not incredible, even when they're brand new, because they all just believed that if you had money, you'd have your own designer, your own taste, you'd rip it out anyway. Setra Ruddy convinced us that we should try something different. And we ended up going along with them. And we were the first that's since been copied everywhere throughout Manhattan. And that was, we bought kitchens from England, from a company called Small Bone of Devices, super high-end kitchens. We were spending $350,000 US dollars a kitchen, which for any developer is unheard of. We're spending 150,000 a bathroom, marble everywhere, just the fixtures and fittings of the waterworks fixtures and fittings, it's 15 grand just for the shower fixture. And when you're buying 100 of those or 200 of those, then that's what adds up. And I tell people, look, because they go, okay, so you charge 15 grand more. But as you know, and your friends know, it's not just the 15 grand, you're borrowing all that money. So you're paying 15 and 20% on that money as well over 5 years. So we went overboard. We put beautiful bathrooms in and beautiful kitchens, and it was perceived, people thought we were crazy, and developers would tell me and pull me aside, say, no, you haven't been in the game too long, because I tell everyone, no, I'm an interest rate swaps broker. They'd go, listen, this doesn't work. The economics aren't going to work for what you do. But it ended up being that sort of sentiment changed, and now buildings are going very high end, and they are building, and that's one of the selling points now, that we and other buildings will all boast. You don't need to spend another 6 to 9 months changing this, reconfiguring this apartment. You can actually move in, and this is to the taste of and the likes and the attributes of someone who has 10, 20, and $30 million apartments. And so we did the 5 coats of paint on that I didn't know was a thing, but we did everything as high end as possible, and it ended up paying off for us. For again, I could look back now, and at the time I fell into the trap, and there was 4 partners, 2 from PMG and 2 myself and Michael Stern. We fell into the trap of believing our own just thinking that we were a little better than we really were, because we had some extreme success with 2 or 3 projects. But there was geopolitical factors involved as well. There was, from 2011 to 2015, Brexit happened 4 or 5 times. Greece was on the verge of leaving the union, or there was panic about that, and there was even panic that possibly Spain would be leaving. And then I can't remember the name of the president that got in 2012 in France, but he was promising a 60% tax on anyone on any dollars earned over $1 million in France. And that combined with the whole European drama, that the dollar euro literally went from 144 to 105. So the euro continually, over a 3 or 4 year period, just kept getting weaker and weaker and weaker. And you had all this panic that we were also, I realize now in hindsight why so many Europeans were buying, French and English and Europeans were buying our apartments, because that dynamic has gone away now. You selling Manhattan high-end luxury real estate, the Europeans aren't really a factor anymore. There's 1 or 2, but they were a real group unto themselves of 30 or 40% of sales. And they were coming over because they wanted to get their money out of Europe. And so that also helped things. But we ended up selling it out for a 4,500 a square foot sellout instead of the 2,000 that we imagined. And so it ended up being...
Is this what's known as the Steinway Tower?
No, sorry, that was Walker Tower still, but that's what kicked everything off. Yeah. And then Stellar Tower was the next one. So what we did, so the building is called Walker Tower because it was literally designed by a guy called Ralph Walker. And he was called, he was called the architect of the century in 1952 by the New York Times, and yet no one's ever heard of him. And we realized we needed to make something of him in order to make this building. So this building had been a telephone building with, like I said, small windows that we ended up blowing out and making much bigger 10-foot by 10-foot windows, and had huge balconies because it was Art Deco. So the Art Deco, the attributes of an Art Deco, as we call the building's wedding cake. And the reason why, for you probably know, but just for people, I know so many people don't know, is because you want to keep building the building higher, but because of the inability of concrete in 1920s to withstand the pounds per square inch that it can withstand now, you had to make the building go in so that there was less and less stress. You'd have one stress point in the building, but the entire building couldn't be built to take all of that. So as a result, the ceiling heights get lower and lower as you go higher as well. But sorry, what was I talking about? You asked me a question, and I know I wasn't
which is the super slim.
Oh yeah, that's the Steinway. So
when does that come along?
So that was because we made Ralph Walker. What we did with Ralph Walker is we went and met a girl. We found a girl who was studying art history or architectural history and doing a thesis on New York City architecture around the start of the 20th century, and we literally said, we'll buy 3,000 of your books, and we want you to focus on Ralph Walker. And we ended up having an exhibition in the building of the 8 significant buildings that Ralph Walker had built in New York. And we got his name known. And then like I said, we built the next building in Hell's Kitchen. We called it after his wife. He designed it 1 year later. It was a 1930 building. We called it Stellar Tower. And so we got into the whole tower mode, and that was when Starwood came to us and said, guys, can you please build this non-union on 57th Street? And that was, we literally bought, they had a small piece of land. Look, they ended up getting out after because with real estate, everything changes as you're buying more real land and more the cap stack structure changes, cap stack changes, and people want in and out on different concepts. The building next door to us, which was a very famous building, which was built for and by the Steinway piano family, that was coming up for sale, and we ended up buying that, and hence we designed the building to come out of that building, and we called the building, our super tall is called Steinway Tower because it literally comes out of the Steinway piano tower.
Yeah, and it's an incredible looking building. If you haven't seen any photos or videos of it, it's a freaking amazing looking building. But give us a sense of how tall it is, how big it is.
So when you go for loans in America, you literally have to market yourself. It's more than the spreadsheet. You have to we put together full books and presentations just to wow the bankers, because there's still that emotional part involved with everything. And so it's surprising, because it's another thing. Sometimes Australians say to me, oh, we couldn't do this back home. And it is a little bit different in Australia, where it's changed a bit in the last few years with some of these ancillary lenders that have come along that are taking the place of the banks. But the beauty of America is that you can, whenever you're down and out and you think, and I've been there many times with different projects, and think, where are we going to get this money from? There's always another door to knock on. You've never hit the end of the road. You could keep getting depressed by keep getting no's, but there's always more doors to knock on. There's an unlimited number of doors, and it's such a massive country that there's always someone trying to get into, for instance, the Manhattan real estate. There's firms in Texas or in South Carolina or in Colorado or in Utah that you've never heard of, with just a couple of $1 billion waiting to be deployed somewhere. And they've always been waiting for their opportunity. And then they just suddenly come up, and you think, wow, this is unbelievable that we're doing something with the Bank of Ozarks down in, no one's ever heard of them. And we started doing this small banks in Texas. Anyway, so I learned about, we put together these books we needed $600 million loan for Steinway Tower. And so we put together a presentation, and we have them all in this room, and we literally put on a concert for them. But in putting together this book and this presentation, we had a psychologist help us with it. And she was always telling me about the psychology of symmetry. I've got those words stuck in my mind because she just talked about it all, how the human brain is drawn to symmetry and the beauty of symmetry. And so we'd have photos of looking down on rowing crews and beautiful people and, indigenous people with that beautiful look. And the reason why I'm saying that is because Steinway Tower literally is at the middle of Central Park, and Central Park just opens below you like a carpet being rolled out in front of you, and being dead center and that symmetrical feel, it really is amazing that no matter how many thousands of times I've been there, you never ever get sick of it. You never ever take it for granted. You never ever think, been there, done that. It really is beautiful. And so that project has, that project was nowhere near, it's an unbelievable feeling of what is there. And if you come over, I'd love to take you there one day. And it's an incredible, everything we did was amazing. It's 1,440 feet high. So people always ask, how tall is it? Look, I just say 10 foot of floor, 140 floors. But is there 140 floors? No. We have 400 feet of of this crown, which is wind stabilization equipment. And so even to build that building, we had to spend 18 months in a Canadian wind tunnel testing system. And we spent, I think, $1.3 million in 18 months testing this building in a wind tunnel, to not only for the engineering of the building, but we needed to be able to show, and this is what everyone needs to do in the city. So wind shear is when wind hits something and shears off it. It actually speeds up. we had to prove, and with our design, you have to, and anyone who does this has to say what they're doing to mitigate what's called wind shear. So the wind doesn't speed up and hit people on the ground, and you don't have wind tunnels all throughout Manhattan. So we tested it not only for its stability, because it's the skinniest, tallest skyscraper in the world, but also for that wind shear factor. And we actually, so that's a long-winded way of saying the crown and even the design of the exterior is a lot of it is being put there to do with wind. And our crown is so high that you literally have this tank at the top of it filled with water with, I just like put it, I know your audience is more educated, but most people can't conceive, but I'm telling them it's like one huge steel marble, a huge ball bearing in this huge tank with tons and tons and tons of water. And we have these arms we have sensors at the top of the building, and depending on where the wind's going and how hard it's blowing, these arms push this ball around, and that's what stabilizes the building, along with a bunch of other things. Like, it's literally tied into the ground, but you have this system at the top which moves this counterweight around to counteract the wind. And I've seen online that some people were up there and they felt it move or something. I've been up there 1,500 times. I've never felt the building move once. I've never seen it move once. I have been there at the top. I'd love to take people right up to the crown and walk up the stairs and go as high as they can or as high as they feel comfortable. And I have been up there before where it snows on us and yet it's sunny and beautiful day down the bottom, which is crazy. But
is that the building that also has a gap in the middle of it to allow wind to pass through?
Yes. So two of the buildings do, where we have two, and that's designed for the wind. Yes, us and 432 Park.
So
we took a lot of their
floors that have nothing on them that just allow wind to pass through the building.
Correct. But we ended up selling those floors for 10 million each. So we have to let wind go through, but we could sell them to the floors, to the people either above or below, and they could have their own garden there. And you'd be surprised in 4 or 5 months a year, there's not that much wind at all. Like, yeah, in winter, it's horrible and you wouldn't ever want to be out there, but they're very cool areas that people are putting in sort of outdoor gardens and sun lounges and things like that.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. So all we need to prove to Department of Buildings is that wind can go through. It doesn't matter that people have put up some outdoor equipment, furniture.
So was there any point when you're doing all this stuff for that project where you're thinking, what am I doing? This technology and engineering that's required to build a super slim tower, were you thinking, I'm over here?
Most developers, I think, give themselves too much credit, and other people give the developer too much credit for thinking that they're wonder people. What we do is, or like any business, you have to have amazing people. So you have to be, all that matters is the money, essentially. But the skill in being the head of any business and the head of being a developer is knowing enough to know when you're being ripped off or when money's being ineffectively spent. But the real smart people are the people you're hiring. And so we were hiring people who had built this other significant super tall called 432 Park. I remember sitting in dozens of the hundreds of meetings they had. They were MIT physicists and structural engineers deciding on the exact way the pylons, the width and length and depth of the pylons and the amount of steel and the rebar, the type of rebar and how it would be attached. And there's so much math that goes into this and so much intellectual thought that it makes me laugh when people go, oh, I wouldn't, how do you know it won't fall over? Like, nothing was done by mistake. And so yes, I sit there all the time in some of these meetings and I'm grateful that I get to I love being with really intelligent people who are experts in their different fields. I've loved learning a lot more about all sorts of materials. Look, even just digging the, even just digging out, attempting to get the 120 feet below ground that we needed to get. Because it's New York, you not only have to get below an area that is on rock, and that's one of the reasons why you can build these things. You're on a very solid base, but it's basic. Midtown is all rock. So you have to dig into rock, but you have to be conscious of this, the subway system, which is 120 years old and weaves throughout the system, as does the sewage system, as does piping that's come along over the last 100 years. There's so many different things. So you can't just go down there and blow rock up, and you can't have large equipment. We had guys drilling with jackhammers for a year and a half. I actually felt so sorry for them while I was watching it. It was like we were back in 1920. We were doing stuff with small scale equipment. Sorry. And so, but learning about that and was fascinating. Learning about I just, even going to Canada and being part of this wind tunnel testing to see the things that they did and the way they can tell you how the wind's going to react and from when it comes from a different angle was incredible. Working with these structural engineers and look, one of the reasons, of course, most people don't know, but one of the reasons why you can build a Burj Khalifa and any of these super talls in the Middle East and in Asia and America is because in the last 25 years there was another step up in or 30 years in concrete technology, and so working with people in for it to be able to withstand an extra magnitude of thousands of pounds of pressure per square inch. And so all of those factors came together, but I only learned about that by being in these meetings with those people. So it was fascinating. And look, to be a developer, it's about being a jack of all trades. You don't have to be an expert in anything, but you do need to know when you need to know very fast, like in anything, when someone's pulling the wool over your eyes, or you need to at least be suspicious.
And at what point did you quit your day job, David?
So I was comfortable enough in 2012 when I really thought I bought the Brooklyn in 2008 and then bought Walker Tower in 2009. And then in 2012, I was like, okay, I can move into this full time, because I was still thought, and up until then, that I was an imposter anyway. What do I know? And this is all going to come to an end very soon. Yeah, it's ended up since then. We've done a bunch of stuff in Miami. And I used to spend a fair bit of time down there. I'm not doing anything now. And look, it's funny how life takes you in different directions. Now I'm not doing anything in Manhattan. I'm developing industrial real estate in Pennsylvania and Ohio and building factories in Colombia and Mexico. And so I never thought that would be happening. I never thought I'm off to Colombia on Tuesday for a week. I go there for a week, a month. It's just funny the directions that things change. Everything changed for me in COVID. I decided, so Australians, Australians have never known a downturn, and they think a downturn is that prices came off for 2% or 3% for 6 months. And Australians think that you just can wait it out. America, like I said, has real ups and downs. And when people saw the extreme success we had with Walker Tower and then a few other, Stellar Tower, there was the oversupply was incredible. Suddenly everyone came into the market and wanted to develop stuff in Manhattan, and then the city, not just the Manhattan, but the whole of New York City, got so overdeveloped with high-end real estate, and that was COVID for me was the final thing. Like we need another clean out, and I'm not prepared to come back in and compete with all of this cheaper money. Whereas that, I don't think that happens as much, for instance, in Australia. The good and the bad of it is a lot of my friends will tell me, they'll never give us they'll say, for start, there's only 4 banks. And if one of them passes, they all pass. They all have the exact same criteria. And if they hear that, if ANZ hears that Commonwealth turn you down, they just don't even look. They just say, no, no, no. And so there's no real competition. Whereas in America, there's always competition. There's always someone who, rightly or wrongly, arrogantly or not, says, well, they made a mistake. We know more than them. We'll finance this, etc. But there's not that attitude with financing in Australia. And of course, there's this attitude that you have to be 60% sold or 80% sold before we'll give you the money. And so I've done projects where we make them 12 and 14-foot ceilings, or, like I said, small bone kitchens. Whereas my friends will say to me, like, ANZ will just tell me, no, we're not financing that. And if NAB, and if they're not doing it, no one else will do it. And so they said they'll give you their floor print for what their footprint for what they believe will sell, and you can either build that or not. But if you try to say, no, we're trying to build, larger balconies here, or, a bit more Uber this or Uber that, they just go, yeah, but do it with someone else. So because there's more competition here, there's more room to do that. And that's a plus, but it's also a minus, because the reason why ANZ and NAB are conservative and only fit to a certain footprint is because they do know what they're doing and they don't lose money, and that stuff does sell. It creates, yes, you could say, a bit boring product times and nothing really varies, but they just want their money back. What happens in the States is you're given a lot more leeway, and there's a lot more people who take a bet on you, but you yourself are risking a lot as well. And so I think, one of the things with that Steinway building, which is like the apple in my eye and just like one of the loves of my life, but we came onto the market in late 2019, and we were already, as everyone knows, with every construction project, there's always 10 things that happen that were completely out of your control that you never thought would happen. And so we were already a year or two behind time. And so we came onto the market in November 2019, and literally a who's who of the world flew their planes in and came and visited the building. And because it's $30 to $70 million apartments and generally pied-à-terres, so 57th Street is a street that a lot of New Yorkers or a lot of people would think, well, I wouldn't really want to live on that street. And the reason why those super talls are on 57th Street is there was the assemblage you can get. There's the assemblage that you can buy to get what's called the floor area, the FAR, the air rights. But B,
sorry,
the buildings.
Just quickly, for those who haven't read the book or know about it, assemblage is when you put together the parcels of land that are all next to each other, which then allows you, for some reason, to be able to build a taller building than if you were just on one block. Is that right? Correct. Because every block has its own height that it's legally allowed to go to anyway. And in those non-historic areas, so for instance, all of the west side is generally historic, and but in lots of Midtown, which people see as the office area, doesn't have these historic designations, and you are allowed. There's micro areas within the area, and they have been designated certain height levels, and many buildings didn't go to that. So if you were allowed to build a 12-story building and there was only an 8-story, there really is 4 more stories. Now it's measured in square feet, and that's why they call it floor area ratio on what you're allowed. And they call it, there's a ratio on height to foot. And so I'm just making it as simple as possible. But if it was 4 floors, then you're allowed 4 floors. So I could come along and say, hey, you didn't use your 4 floors. Can I buy them off you? And that's what you're doing when you're buying air rights. And so the Central Park, which is the crown jewel of Manhattan real estate, the west side, the east side, which is Fifth Avenue, and Central Park South are the esteemed places to live. And
everyone's heard of the co-ops in America. Co-ops mean you buy a share in the building, and so you're a shareholder of a building. You don't actually own land. Now, it just so happens to know that your share corresponds to your apartment, but you can't go to someone and say, "Hey, I literally own land." No, you're an owner of a co-op. Anyway, that's the reason. The people who are members of this co-op can then vote in or vote out anyone, or they can deny anyone entry to the building. They can decide who they want in there. There had been, for all of the 90s and the O's, as all of Asia and the Middle East was becoming fantastically wealthy, there had been this huge pent-up demand. There was emirs and princes that were trying to pay the $80 million co-op, famous places on Museum Mile, on Fifth Avenue, on the Upper East Side, and they're bidding 120 million. The King of Saudi Arabia bidding 120 million, and the co-op boards are just saying, "No, we don't want you." And any foreigner, the co-ops basically don't want anyone who's not going to live in it. They don't want people as a second who wants that building to use it as their second home. And there's lots of buildings have their own special little thing, but basically you can't not have it as your main residence. And so none of the co-ops would let any of these uber rich Russians or Arabs or Asians into these prestigious co-ops. And so there was this pent-up demand for Asians, Arabs, and Russians to say, "I've got a pied-à-terre in New York overlooking Central Park." And that's why 157 West, the first one, had unbelievable success. And that was the success of that. And it just sold out in only a few weeks. And that's prompted all of the other buildings, including mine. There was this huge demand. Now, what ended up happening that's dampened that, is that in 2014, we had a lot of Russian investors invested in Steinway Tower. Russian oligarchs had come to us and wanted to buy the entire project and building office and just sell it to their Russian friends, which we were trying to do. When we were only starting construction, they wanted to just buy the whole lot. Now, there's a law here. You have to go to the Attorney General and you have to get Attorney General approval for your offering plan. And the reason for that, and I'm sure in Australia you have to do something similar, your offering plan has to go to the Attorney General of the state because you're selling someone their home. And as a developer, you are personally liable for their residence for the first 6 years. You can't build, it's like a lemon law. You can't sell someone a home that falls apart. And so that's the basics of the law. You can't just sell someone something that's not to grade, not to standard, and is just going to fall apart. So for the first 6 years, you're on the hook as the developer. And you have to get this Attorney General, this official offering plan approved. And they do a really legal, thorough job. And you have to be fully vested too as the sponsor. And you are not allowed to even, the law is very, very strict. You can't even talk to people about selling something until you've got your offering plan approved. And like I said, the penalties are draconian. And we tried it anyway, and everyone else has tried it. And it's when you go to your lawyers and say, just find a way around this law. These guys have $1 billion and they want to buy the building. Just comply with the law. Just do whatever you can. We'll do it, keep building it like we said, but ownership can go to them. You just find a legal way to do it. Even the law firms say, we're never talking about this again. We don't want your business if you're going to talk about this. Even the law firms, if they aid and abet, this can be put out of business in New York State. So it's taken very, very seriously. But we wanted to sell it. But then what happened in 2014? And we had one of the reasons why I'm developing electricity assets in Ohio is because of these Russian investors. But whatever. We had these Russian investors and they wanted to buy the building. And then in 2014, Putin invaded Crimea. And the US and the world put on sanctions to him. And the ruble dropped from 30 to 90 to the dollar. And so Putin knows that his oligarchs all have their money in Swiss francs and euros and dollars anyway, and maybe some yen. So from his point of view, he said, and by the way, it's part of the reason why they're saying Russia is so economically successful now. He was saying to them, you've just got 3 times richer in ruble terms, because I knew your money wasn't here, it was out there. And so you're going to bring it back, and you're going to start investing in Russia, and you're going to rebuild Russian industry. And if you don't, I'm just going to take it all from you. And they were told very, very clearly that they had to go back and rebuild Russia, every single oligarch. And remember how from 2000 to 2014, 15, every single one of us heard every single 1 or 2 months, we all collectively heard for 15 years, every, let's say 2 or 3 months, about another Russian buying another $500 million yacht, a 500 million euro piece of land in France, the most expensive real estate in Manhattan, buying this or that somewhere in the world. Those stories, buying another football team, those stories were so consistent and so constant that the funny thing is, and I have only pointed out to people now, and they go, oh yeah, you've never heard, no one has ever heard one of those stories ever again since 2015. We've never heard about a Russian buying a football team, a basketball team, a soccer team. We've never heard about a Russian going, and it's still happening, but very silently, and they have to go and get permission from him. We've never heard about them bidding 500 million euros for French property, and doing, because now they've been told, bring your money back and rebuild. And they actually have rebuilt so much of Russia and the industry, and that's part of the reason why I believe he had this long-term goal anyway, but he made them come back. So that took the Russians straight out of the market, and I knew some of these guys and talked to them all the time, and they were scared. They were no one messes with the guy, and so they just eliminated from the market. There was no longer going to be any Russian buyers. And then in 2017, 2018, Xi Jinping went through his purge and suddenly you were no longer hearing about Chinese were no longer coming to New York. Like, they were coming here, they bought the Wall of Astoria, they were buying anything that was iconic. And then suddenly every leader of every firm buying those things was put into jail. And in 2017, they got wiped out of the market. And then 2018, 2019, there was the oil fell to, like, I think it was $15 a barrel. And I remember we were in contract with the Penthouse with the Emir of Qatar, and for no other reason than, well, for 2 reasons. Trump had taken Saudi Arabia's side on a UAE, Saudi on the Yemen. There was the Yemen war, and it's basically UAE and Qatar against Saudi Arabia, and I can't remember who else. And because he backed them, they had said to us, look, they were also in contract with me on a building that I was building. I built 673 apartments on 2 buildings called the American Copper Towers on the 1st Avenue and 36th Street. And we were trying to sell it to them then. And they were just, they already have trillions of dollars of real estate in the States. And they were like, we're not going to do any more, anything that we don't have to do for a long time. And so they just pulled out. Not only did they say it was a bad look for us to be buying this sort of personal real estate at the time, but we don't want to because of geopolitics as well. So within 6 years, we had the Russians, the Chinese, and the Arabs all pull out. But then, okay, we took a few hits to the face. But 2019, we opened in November. So many people came and saw it. Every big name that you've ever heard of in American business, sports, culture came and saw it. And I thought we were going to sell the whole thing out. And then suddenly, and there was constant talk, like you're going back and forth because we're still not finished. Understandably, a lot of the contract is about what if this happens and that, and what if this and that, and if you don't finish. And so we were going back and forth on legal with a lot of law firms, and we thought we were going to sell the whole lot. And then COVID came, and the rules were so ridiculous that even with an empty building, well, for a start, everyone buying the building nearly everyone buying in the building was not going to be a New Yorker. And so there were people on private jets, and they were not flying into Manhattan or no one was flying anywhere. So no one was coming to look at an apartment. And second of all, the city for the first 9 months had this ridiculous rule that you couldn't even take someone to see an empty building standing more than 6 feet away from them. So it literally, it caused more angst than needed to. But COVID sort of, there's so many things that can happen in this city, or I guess anywhere, that you don't plan for, and you think you've got it all covered. And I've moved on now to developing electricity assets and data centers.
So listening to your tales, David, which is awesome, and really incredible projects that you've been involved with. When you sit and look back and have a think, like, what do you think what are some of the key lessons that you've learned about yourself along the way?
I think what I've learned about myself is that you really can learn anything. You don't have to be a master of anything in order to get a good grasp of it. And I've learned that if you are focused, I didn't know anything about development, and I just think that I tell everyone, if you can pivot to something completely different and really master something in shorter period of time to a level where you're competent and you can work in it more easily than you think you can. And so I think of even how now I'm developing data centers, and it's a lot more complicated than it seems. And I didn't know anything about electricity beforehand, but it was some of these guys who were invested with me in Steinway that said, hey, because I worked on a project on that project, American Copper Buildings, that was on an old site that no one knew what to do with, or no one had come up with something. It would be an old Con Ed electricity plant, and the electricity plant got shut down, and for 40 years it had been the Solo company. I'm trying to think of his first name. He'd owned it for a long time, and they sold it to us, and we built these 2 towers. Anyway, the experience of going through that and getting what's called brownfield redevelopment credits, whereby cities, local governments, so city, state, and federal governments give grants to redevelop old land. There's greenfield development, buying new land and just putting something on it. But of course, people want to have, where there once was industry, they want to have a new industry rebuilt, and it's called brownfield redevelopment. And the credits are actually quite complicated. But because I'd worked on that, and it was quite a large project, these guys asked me to come and help them redevelop a old 125-acre paper and pulp mill in a place called Coshocton, Ohio, and it's literally in the Rust Belt, what you heard of. And I ended up getting involved in that, and now and that took me deep into the electricity world, and now I'm building stuff that people are putting NVIDIA AI machines into. So my point is, I'm always emboldened that you can learn something new.
And along the way, what would you say the best piece of advice is that you've ever received?
It's a good question. I've had a lot of advice given to me, and I've needed a lot of advice. The thing that so it's different here in America. I'm going back to where because I so often have people from Australia come over and go, I wouldn't be able to do this, or how did you do that? We'd never get. And one of the beauties of here is it is so big, and there's so much competition, and you're only burdened by the amount of doors or the amount of rejections you're about to you can take. So I would say to people, just keep going, because where there's a will, there's a way. It's not so easy sometimes when I hear different stories about Australia, but I always think of my friend John Foley, who started a bike company called Peloton, and he literally has everything tabulated, and he's got all the records. He went to 400 meetings and told 400 times there's only two types of bikes, road bikes and mountain bikes. Who's ever heard of a spinning bike? And he got 400 rejections, but he just kept going. And at 401st and 402nd and 403rd, he got the tiny amount of money that he was trying to raise to start a company that ended up being worth $20 billion. But it's just to keep going. And look, all I think of is because someone told me, I have lots of friends in finance who are with huge venture capital and private equity firms, and they're on boards of different companies. I'm like, but how do you know so much? Like, you're in these very technical companies, and they say to me the same thing. You can learn anything. And I'm not there to be the expert. I'm there to know enough to know when I should be raising the level of concern. And so that's all I would say is I've been told that just know enough to get in the game and get in the game.
And then I'm sure you must speak with lots of people who are developers. Many of them who probably see what you've done, the transition you've gone from, well, big project really from the beginning to even bigger ones. And if people say to you, look, would really like to take my own developing to the next level, what advice do you give them?
So this is probably another thing about America too. You put the same amount of work in if it's a 10-story project as you do with a 100-story project, or a 50 or 30 apartments take just as much time to convince people to give you money than it does for 350 apartments. So I always say, if you're going to put in the work, and you are going to have to put in the work, and you're going to have to beg, borrow, and steal, real estate is always about the money, and it's always about the unlevered money that you have, or the friends and family sort of money that you can get, where you don't have extremely onerous terms and timelines that you have to give it back, because that's what kills you. Of course, you can wait out anything if you've got that luxury, but the problem with real estate is you're up against the clock straight away, and the property may not be appreciating as fast as your loans are, because the cap stack here is where you put in your initial money as the developer, probably 5 or 10% of the project, and then your construction budget is roughly going to be 60% of the cap stack, and then you're getting your extra pieces of mezzanine financing, your junior and senior mezzanine financing, and it's always that last little bit when you needed that last 5 or 6% that's the 18 to 24%. That you think, well, it's only the last year, and when we blend that in, paying 24%, but it's that bit that gets you, because they don't have the mortgage to secure their asset. They actually are the ones that will always foreclose on you. So it's always that you can fall over at the very end. So I tell people, if you're going to put it, your investors are going to bust your balls anyway. So you may as well ask for more and do a bigger project. And people are excited by bigger projects. I found it easier to raise money for a bigger project than for a smaller project. Even if someone was only going to put in $1 million, they sometimes would rather put in $1 million to a $300 million project than $1 million to a $15 million project. People just like being part of something that's big and glamorous. And sometimes I think that's why when we hear about lenders doing silly things and investing in projects that you and I have looked at and read before, when it was just a concept, and said that will never happen. How did they get their financing? But I've realized that the lenders are the same too. They get drawn in by big, shiny objects. So I would say go bigger. But at the same time, because sometimes it's been so onerous to get some of these loans, I've taken that loan approval, and the loan approval is construction loan, and then every time you need to go and get that one more piece of mezzanine financing, You have to jump through the hoops. So you think, wow, well, I've gone through 3 different investment committees now over 3 different years. And you come out of them when you've got the money and you think you've been patting yourself on the back. See, all these smart people agree with me. They really agree that we can sell it for this much a square foot and we'll sell at this velocity. I've just realized that you sometimes question the crowd. The crowd isn't always right. I've thought that I was doing things where I was infallible because the crowd also agreed with me, but that isn't always the way.
How do you keep track of a capital stack that must be unbelievably exotic on $100 million projects?
Yep, and we have pie charts and diagrams that cross over 2 or 3 pages. A lot of legal work, that's for sure, because people want it constantly renewed and reiterated every time something does or doesn't happen, every time a question happens. And then there's different payout structures and different speeds of payout. And so, yeah, it's quite complicated. That is an art unto itself.
Oh, there was one thing I was thinking when I read through the book Billionaire's Row, hearing about these capital stacks, thinking, how on earth do they keep track of how these things work?
Yeah, and so what I would say too about that is where the developers are incentivized to, most of the lenders want 2 to 3 times their money in 2 to 3 years, maybe 4 years. 2 times is good, and 3 times is really good. And they just want to rinse and repeat. They aren't looking to knock anything out of the park. And so, although that's fantastic, but they aren't looking for 10 times, like they're investing in Google or something. But so what they do is they incentivize the developers with this IRR, with IRRs. And the higher the IRR we give them back their money, the higher we'll take of the back end. So the IRR is how much we get back to them in how much time. So we're incentivized to get them back their money, their initial slug, as fast as possible. And then the faster we get it back, the higher the IRR clock ticks. And as it goes higher, we can take, even though we put in 5% of the cap stack, 5, 6, 7% of the cap stack, we could be 15% on the back end, and it can grow to 20% and grow to 25%. So by the time they've got a 3x back, we might be taking 25 or 30%. Now, it just so happens that we negotiated with Starwood because they didn't believe it would ever happen. They received a 46 IRR from that project. They didn't believe anything that we would ever get near what we got, and neither did we really. But one of the guys, I certainly didn't know, but one of the guys on the team, the old wiry guy, had been doing it for 30 years, said, well, what if, had all these what ifs in there. And if it went over a 35 IRR, which is already extraordinary for real estate, for a lender, that we would flip through it to being 75% of the back end and them being 25%. And they agreed to that. And that was where the real, and for all of our projects, and I know a lot of people structure it, you structure it so that the lender will give you an outsized return if you make them happy very quickly. But if you don't, everyone thinks real estate developers are incredibly wealthy. You get penalized very heavily. You might have put all that work in, because you're not putting all the work in to put in 6%. You're putting your own money at risk for a start. And your money is at risk at the start. So your money's in there for the longest. And you're not putting it in so you can just get 6% of the back end. You're trying to obviously lever that 5 or 6% to being 20% or 25% of the project. So you get very heavily penalized when you think you've put in thousands of hours of work and you put that in and then just got a little bit back at the end. So the whole thing is you need to do it on time, on budget.
So the Verizon building, the one that I think you did really, really well out of.
That's Walker Tower.
Walker Tower.
And then Stella Tower after that in Hell's Kitchen was a Verizon project.
So was there ever a day where you just got some a huge amount of money landed in the company bank account when settlements started happening? Was there like a big capital event at any stage where you went, oh my God, this is unbelievable?
Yeah. Yes, because this guy flipped the switch on Starwood, and because it went, the IRRs were returned, we made tens of millions more than we each, the four of us, than we were supposed to. So we all got apartments in the building. We all got 15, 16, 17 million dollars worth of property in the building, and we all took out, multiples of that in cash.
Must have been an amazing day.
Yeah, it was. It was pretty good. But like I said, you can believe your own exuberance in Manhattan or anywhere. And when you have that sort of success, I certainly believed it. And there's plenty of ways to whittle down that later on, because there is real swings here. And like I said, the danger is that with it being a developer, like all developers know, is you're up against the clock. The general public, just if you say developer thing, oh, you're rich, or you can never lose. But we all of us developers spend a lot of time staring at the ceiling thinking, oh, have I got this right? And that's why I'm always surprised when I hear industry magazines and etc. interviewing different developers and them telling you what they think the public wants and this and that. No one's telling them, and they don't know. They don't know 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 years in advance. A lot of them believe their own. I don't know. We're all just touching. We're all doing our best, but no one knows.
Well, and certainly the last few years when there's been a lot of delays that kind of beyond the control of developers, all the pandemic delays, supply shortages, labor shortages. I mean, it's just the absolute killer that you have no control over. But the banks don't stop their clocks, do they? They don't stop their interest clocks.
Correct. They don't stop at all, and they didn't care about COVID. Like, yes, there was moratoriums for a little while, and then they've just come and collected it all later on. There's no judges that are ever just sympathetic to the poor property developer. They're just like, sorry, you had a contract, you knew what you were doing, there it is. And yes, you got a moratorium for a year or two during COVID, but now pay the guy. So it's I mean, I've done a lot of development in Miami, and one of the benefits of that used to be it was a low cost area, and now it's doubled in price, the cost of labor, as you say, and etc. And Florida's just gone through the roof in those sort of costs that no one would have budgeted for initially.
Did I read somewhere? Sorry to interrupt you. Did I read somewhere that you got involved with selling as well?
I got my license for a couple of different reasons. I did a particular project in Chelsea called the Fitzroy, and in 514 West 24th Street, and it was one of these projects where we had paid too much. We all know, anyone listening to this knows, you can never cure a bad basis, and we got caught up in the exuberance of the area of Far West Chelsea, and it was going through this boom. We paid too much, and I had said to my wife, I think the only money I'm going to make from this is if you start selling these things for us. And she got her broking license, and then it did really well. And then there's a law here. It's really well defined between sponsor and broker. And my lawyer the lawyer at JDS was telling me that I was crossing over some of a grey area where I could put them into, and he said, it just get your license. And then I didn't end up selling anything there, and I was doing it and I dragged my feet on it. But then with the Steinway Tower, I had, so it just so happens that I wasn't going into it, but I got into these electricity assets in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and I started selling electricity to Bitcoin miners, and I got really into the whole Bitcoin community, and it's amazing. That's just a whole new world, and I learned a lot about that industry. And because of that, and because people knew me, I was approached by some people who wanted to be the first people that would sell real estate via a coin, via the blockchain. So one day we will be buying and selling real estate via blockchain, but it's new times at the moment. And to do it, they had to get through CFTC and SEC legislation, etc. And one of the rules for New York State is there has to be a broker. A broker has to, even though we were going to try and sell one of these $46 million apartments. So we were going to fractionalize an apartment, basically. We're going to put it on this blockchain, and we're going to sell 46,000 pieces of $10,000 a piece apartment. So 46,000 people would own it. And that was the concept. But to do that, a long-winded story, to do that, I need to get my license. So I had started the process with my wife, dragged my feet on it, and I closed it for them. And I worked for 3 years on this project to sell real estate via blockchain. And so, yes, that's what I had to become a fully licensed broker, which here is about doing a course for a 2-week course every day for 2 weeks, and then taking a whole lot of questions every year.
So what's ahead, David? What's ahead? You've kind of climbed some mountains. What's left for you to do over the next 5 to 10 years with property?
Well, I'm very deep into this, into these electrical assets. So I don't know if I'll be doing any residential in Manhattan. There's a chance I'll be back in Florida soon. I'm I work closely and I consult for this company called PMG, Property Markets Group, that I did a number of projects with here in Manhattan. And so you never know. I could be in Colorado or Texas or Florida at some stage, trying my hand there.
Well, for a guy who's done some big projects, you've still got a pretty good head of hair there.
It's gone a little
Could have
grey.
been that stressful, eh?
Yeah, it's a little grayer though than it used to be.
All right. Well, it's been great talking with you, David. Is there any last comments you want to make before we wind things up? I could keep you here for another few hours, but I'm happy to let you go. But is there any last comments you wanted to make?
No, just be well. Good to talk to you. And I'll stay in touch with the program.
If people want to find out more about you or your projects, where should they head?
I'm actually putting together a website soon, which is going to have all of my projects and everything like that in it. But generally, I'm just on LinkedIn, David Juracich, Juracich.
And I think I looked at the JDS website that had awesome flyover or fly past of the Steinway Tower, which is absolutely worth checking out.
Yeah, it is amazing. It is amazing. So JDS is now a Florida-based company, and it's Michael himself. And look, people always say to me, "But that was your company or this." It's not really. It's just a name. As you know, like every project is a separate legal entity unto itself with a separate cap stack with separate investors. Yes, the developer will take some development fees or some construction fees, and with that, you pay your staff of 20, 25 people, and they tend to be, lawyers and architects and planners and property managers, building managers, but and some engineers. So they're all sort of expensive labor. And we found it was only ever just where it was always a struggle to make the fees that we could charge pay for everything for the office, basically. And I guess that office or that team of 20, 25 people is your competitive advantage. You think with your team and your knowledge that you've built up, because sometimes some people say, why don't you come back to Australia, or why don't you come over to England, do this and that? And I say, yeah, but my competitive advantage is I have a team that knows how to get through local laws and knows how to get permitting done, and I know exactly what will sell on what street and what won't sell in Manhattan or in Miami, but I don't know that elsewhere. And if we run a lean organization, like if we were a bigger firm, like a Related or something, yeah, they can just afford to just and those guys, the real firms, have cheaper money because they have investors who just put in money in investment portfolios, and they're not taking, strange amount of money in the cap stack to get finished off. So my point is, the company itself has basically changed and dissolved. And Michael, the partner that I was doing it with, he's moved to Florida and trying his hand at a couple of things there. And I have 4 kids, and I'm based in Manhattan, and so I'm just I'm taking a pause on Manhattan.
Well, with 4 kids, you'll always be tired, I would imagine. Needing a break.
Little.
All right, David, it's been so awesome to talk with you. Really great stories. Nice to hear of an Aussie over there doing some pretty amazing things in the American property market, and some projects that you can always look back on that'll stand the test of time.
It's lovely to talk to you.
It's been great having you on the Property Developer Podcast.
Thanks, mate. Be well.
You've been listening to the Property Developer Podcast. Tune in next time for more tips, ideas and inspiration to take your developing to the next level. For more developing love, make sure to visit propertydeveloperpodcast.com.